Welcome. Today we will conduct a hierarchical legal analysis of a foundational piece of Indian environmental legislation, the Wildlife Protection Act of 1972.
Let us begin with a single, stark number, 4,000. This is the approximate global population of tigers today, a truly catastrophic decline from over 100,000 a century ago. It was precisely this crisis that served as the direct impetus for the legislation we are examining. To properly understand any legislation, we must begin at its source of authority. Therefore, our first section will examine the constitutional and statutory foundation of the Act, which establishes its place within India's supreme law. The Act's legal and moral authority stems directly from the Constitution of India itself. Two articles are paramount. First, Article 48A states, "The state shall endeavor to protect and improve the environment and to safeguard the forests and wildlife of the country." This places a clear, positive duty upon the state. Second, this responsibility is extended to the populace through Article 51A, Clause G. It shall be the duty of every citizen of India to protect and improve the natural environment, including forests, lakes, rivers, and wildlife, and to have compassion for living creatures. In essence, the Constitution establishes wildlife protection as both a governmental directive and a fundamental civic duty. With this constitutional mandate firmly established, we now turn to the specific statute. For academic reference, this subject falls under Unit 3. The legislation is the Wildlife Protection Act of 1972, designated as Act Number 53 of that year. It is a comprehensive law, structured across 13 chapters. We will now proceed to our second section, where we will dissect the core statutory provisions. It is here, within the text of the Act itself, that we find the precise definitions, the powers, and the operational limitations of the law. The legal precision of the Act begins with its definitions in Section 2. Under Section 2, subsection 1, an animal is defined as follows. Includes amphibians, birds, mammals, and reptiles and their young, and also includes in the cases of birds and reptiles, their eggs. The critical element here is the scope. The law's protection extends beyond just the adult creature to its offspring and even to the embryonic stage. Next, we examine the legal meaning of hunting under Section 2, subsection 4. The definition states it includes capturing, killing, poisoning, snaring, and trapping of any wild animal and every attempt to do so. You should note that final clause, and every attempt to do so. This significantly broadens the offense to include intent and action, even if that action is ultimately unsuccessful. And finally, the term wildlife itself is defined in Section 2, subsection 13 as includes any animal, bees, butterflies, crustacea, fish, and moths, and aquatic or land vegetation which form part of any habitat. This is a pivotal definition because it expands the Act's protection from fauna alone to the entire habitat, including vegetation and invertebrates, thereby recognizing the interconnectedness of the ecosystem. Having examined these specific legal terms, let us synthesize their overarching purpose. The Act's fundamental object is to protect wild animals, birds, and plants from human encroachment. Philosophically, it refutes the anthropocentric view that the earth belongs to man. Instead, it codifies the principle that man belongs to the earth. The primary mechanism for this is empowering the government to declare protected areas, sanctuaries, and national parks, where activities such as hunting and habitat destruction are strictly prohibited. Every statute presents a balance of powers and exceptions. The essentials of this act are fourfold: a clear prohibition on hunting specified animals, the explicit protection of endangered plants, the authority to declare protected areas, and the power to regulate trade in wildlife products. However, the Act also contains carefully circumscribed limitations. Section 11, for example, permits the killing or wounding of an animal in self-defense or for specified scientific purposes under a permit. Furthermore, Section 65 acknowledges and protects the pre-existing traditional hunting rights of the scheduled tribes of the Nicobar Islands. Let us now transition from legal theory to practical application in our third section. Here, we will explore application and prohibitions through specific scenarios to understand how the Act functions in real-world contexts. Consider three distinct scenarios. First, the case of self-defense. A person kills a wild animal in a legitimate act of protecting themselves. Under the Act, this is not an offense. However, the animal carcass remains the property of the government. Second, illegal entrance. A person enters a designated sanctuary with weapons and without proper authorization. This constitutes a punishable offense under Chapter 4. And third, habitat damage. A person is found removing wildlife or damaging the habitat within a national park. This action is expressly prohibited by Section 35.
The Act also specifies the legal grounds upon which authorities may refuse certain permissions. Under Section 38-H, a zoo can be denied official recognition if the controlling authority is not satisfied that it meets the prescribed standards for conservation and protection. Similarly, in Chapter 3-A, a request for a permit to pick or uproot specified plants can be refused if the purpose is not for legitimate education, scientific research, or for collection in a herbarium. A statute's text is given its full meaning through judicial interpretation. In our fourth section, we will analyze landmark judicial pronouncements from the Supreme Court of India to understand how the judiciary has shaped and enforced this act.
Our first landmark case is Animal and Environment Legal Defense Fund versus Union of India, reported in 1997, Volume 3 of the Supreme Court Cases at page 549. The facts before the Supreme Court were as follows. The government of Madhya Pradesh had granted permits for traditional fishing to 305 tribal families within a reservoir located inside Pench National Park. The central issue was whether these permits violated the core objectives of the Wildlife Act. The court's ratio decidendi was that a balance must be struck between environmental protection and the economic sustainability of local communities. The final decision upheld the permits but mandated strict government monitoring to prevent any ecological damage.
The next case is Pradeep Krishan versus Union Bank of India from 1996, Volume 8, Supreme Court Cases at page 599. Here, the petitioner challenged a government order that permitted villagers to collect tendu leaves from within state sanctuaries. The issue at hand was whether this activity would inevitably lead to damage of flora and fauna and cause a reduction in forest cover. In its ratio, the court elevated the protection of the environment to the status of a fundamental right under the Constitution. The decision did not quash the order, but it directed the state to implement urgent measures to prevent any shrinkage of the forest. We now turn to Tarun Bharat Singh, Alwar versus Union of India, a 1992 case from Volume 2 of the Supreme Court Cases, page 448. The facts were stark. The Rajasthan government had issued 400 separate licenses for mining operations within the Sariska Tiger Park, which is a declared sanctuary. The legal issue was whether commercial mining could ever be considered a valid activity within a protected sanctuary. The court's ratio was unequivocal. Commercial mining is fundamentally incompatible with conservation, as it destroys the very ecosystem the law intends to protect. The decision was therefore to ban all 400 mining operations and to appoint an expert committee to assess the damage. Our final case is Center for Environmental Law, WWF versus Union of India, reported in 1998, Volume 9 Supreme Court Cases, at page 623. This case concerned administrative compliance. Several states had failed to perform their statutory duty to constitute wildlife advisory boards and appoint honorary wardens. The issue was simple. Were these appointments merely discretionary or a mandatory requirement of the Act? The court's ratio was that these were mandatory duties, and the failure to perform them was a violation of the law. Consequently, the decision was a direct order, compelling the states to constitute the boards and make the appointments within a firm 2-month deadline. Having reviewed the law's foundation, its text, and its judicial interpretation, we arrive at our final section, implementation and exam revision. We will first map the Act's administrative hierarchy and then consolidate the most critical facts for recall. The implementation of the Act follows a clear, top-down statutory hierarchy. At the national level, the central government appoints the Director of Wildlife Preservation. Authority then flows down to the state government, which in turn appoints a chief wildlife warden. For guidance and oversight, a state wildlife advisory board is constituted. This administrative structure is then empowered to take action, such as the declaration of a sanctuary or national park. Finally, specialized regulatory bodies like the Central Zoo Authority and the National Tiger Conservation Authority oversee specific areas of conservation. To conclude, let us consolidate the key information for quick revision. The statutory date of the Act is 1972. The key penalty for major offenses is imprisonment for up to 3 years and a fine of up to 25,000 rupees. We must remember the tiger population figures that prompted this legislation, a drop from over 100,000 in the 18th century to roughly 4,000 today. And finally, to place this in a global context, the CITES Convention currently lists over 3,000 animal and 24,000 plant species as endangered, underscoring the continuing and critical importance of robust legal protections like the Wildlife Protection Act.